They thought he was finished. An aging widower with nothing left but memories, a pension, and a rusty old car. They laughed at his simplicity. They mocked his modest life. They even whispered that maybe he was just waiting to fade away. But they didn't know the truth. Jerry Williams had spent decades building something greater than money. With his late wife Margaret, he had forged a hidden empire of quiet strength. Investments, properties, wealth beyond their wildest dreams. And yet, he chose humility. He chose silence. He chose to give. Until one night, everything changed. In a ballroom glittering with lights and laughter, humiliation struck. His daughter-in-law's hand cut across his face, and his only son sat silent, watching. One slap. One betrayal. One moment that tore a father's heart in two. But what no one expected was that the slap would awaken him. What follows is not just a family's downfall, it is a story of revenge without violence, of dignity reclaimed, of a man who rose from the ashes of betrayal to become a national symbol of resilience. This is Jerry's story. And it will make you question how far love should go, and what happens when love is betrayed. Before we dive in, let me ask you, have you ever been underestimated, pushed aside, or treated as though your worth had expired? If yes, you'll feel every beat of Jerry's journey. Share your thoughts in the comments, and let us know where you're watching from. It's powerful to see voices from all over the world connected by one story. Now lean closer. Because Jerry Williams is about to teach us all that it's never too late to fight back. Jerry Williams entered the world in the spring of 1957, in a steel town that was neither glamorous nor forgiving. The air smelled of iron and coal dust. The streets were lined with row houses where paint peeled faster than families could afford to replace it, and the men carried the weight of their labor not only in their hands but in the stoop of their shoulders. Life was not easy there, but for young Jerry it was honest. His father, Henry Williams, was a steelworker through and through, a man who rose before dawn, packed a tin lunch pail, and walked to the mill with a kind of grim pride. Henry was not a man of many words, but when he spoke, his voice carried like the clang of steel on steel. He taught Jerry that a man's worth was not in what he wore or what he drove, but in how he stood in the face of hardship. "Son," he would say, his hands still blackened from the day's work, "if you can hold your head up after a hard day, then you've done enough." Jerry's mother, Ruth, was the softer balance. A schoolteacher, she stretched their modest income like magic. She could sew a shirt out of scraps, turn leftovers into a feast, and keep the house warm with little more than thrift and ingenuity. Ruth believed that education was the key to rising above circumstance, but she never allowed her son to think himself better than anyone. "Dignity," she would remind him, "isn't bought. It's how you treat people when no one's watching." From his father, Jerry inherited a backbone of iron. From his mother, the gentleness of compassion. Together, those lessons planted the seeds that would guide his every choice. Growing up, Jerry didn't have much in material things. His shoes often wore thin before the school year was out, and Christmas mornings brought more homemade gifts than store-bought toys. But he never felt poor. His parents gave him something money couldn't buy: security in their love and an unshakable moral compass. While other boys bragged about the newest bicycle or baseball glove, Jerry learned to be proud of fixing the old one, making it last another season. School was where Jerry began to notice differences between himself and other children. Some kids mocked his worn hand-me-downs, but he didn't let it break him. Instead, he quietly outperformed them in class, a mix of natural intelligence and his mother's insistence that homework came before play. He grew accustomed to being underestimated, a theme that would follow him throughout his life. By the time he was 12, Jerry had taken on odd jobs: shoveling snow, mowing lawns, delivering newspapers. He handed most of the money to his mother, proud to ease her burden even in small ways. That discipline, that sense of responsibility, gave him a maturity beyond his years. When other boys his age squandered their nickels on candy, Jerry saved his, tucking coins into a jar beneath his bed. He liked the feeling of watching something grow no matter how slowly. One evening, Jerry sat with his father on the back porch, the sunset casting long shadows over the worn fence. Henry lit a cigarette, took a slow drag, and told his son something that would lodge itself in his memory forever. "The world doesn't owe you comfort, Jerry. You earn every bite, every roof, every bit of respect. But don't ever mistake earning for showing off. The strongest men are the ones nobody notices until the world needs them." It was a heavy lesson for a boy, but Jerry absorbed it the way steel absorbs heat, silently, deeply, until it shaped him. By high school, Jerry was known not as the loudest or the flashiest, but as the dependable one. Teachers trusted him, friends leaned on him, and even when bullies tried to get under his skin, Jerry's calm dignity disarmed them. He had a quiet confidence that didn't need defending. Looking back later in life, Jerry would see these years as the furnace that forged his character. They gave him humility in the face of pride, discipline in the face of temptation, and dignity in the face of ridicule. He didn't know it yet, but these lessons would be the armor he would one day wear when betrayal came from the people closest to him. The Williams family never had much money, but they had something greater: resilience. Ruth's faith in education pushed Jerry to dream beyond the steel town. Henry's stoic strength reminded him that life was not measured by applause but by the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. Those values carried Jerry through late nights of study, through part-time jobs to afford books, and through the silent struggles of a young man who wanted to give his parents more than life had given them. Yet, despite his growing achievements, Jerry never developed arrogance. He walked with the same humility his parents had taught him, blending into the background while quietly building the foundation of his future. The other boys may have laughed at his patched jeans, but Jerry would later stand where they could not, on the threshold of a life that required patience, not pride. If you've ever grown up in a family where money was scarce but values were rich, you'll understand Jerry's beginnings. Those lessons never leave you, they live in your bones, shaping the choices you make for decades to come. Let me know in the comments, did you grow up in a home where humility and hard work were more valuable than money? Or do you wish you had? Share your experience, I'd love to hear it. For Jerry Williams, the boy from the steel town, humble beginnings were not a curse but a gift. They planted seeds that would one day bloom into a story far larger than anyone in that neighborhood could have imagined. And though no one knew it yet, the quiet boy saving nickels in a jar would one day stand as a man whose strength, dignity, and hidden fortune would shake the very foundations of those who underestimated him. By the time Jerry Williams stepped onto the campus of his state university in the fall of 1975, he carried more than a suitcase and a stack of textbooks. He carried the weight of his parents' sacrifices, the echo of his father's warnings, and the quiet determination of a young man who refused to waste the chance his mother had fought so hard to give him. College was overwhelming at first. The endless rows of brick buildings, the buzzing dormitories, the constant chatter of students who seemed to have come from another world entirely. Many of them wore brand new clothes, drove cars their parents had gifted them, and spoke casually of summer vacations and places Jerry had only ever seen in magazines. Jerry, meanwhile, worked evenings at the campus library and weekends at a local diner, patching his jeans when they tore and budgeting every dollar down to the penny. But he didn't resent it. On the contrary, Jerry felt sharper, more alive, knowing that every lecture, every test, every late-night study session was something he was earning, not being handed. If anything, his modest background gave him a focus that many of his peers lacked. It was during one of those long nights in the library that Jerry first noticed Margaret Lane. She sat 3 tables over, hunched over an accounting textbook, a pencil tucked behind her ear, her brown hair falling in waves around her face. Unlike the other girls who whispered in groups or flipped through glossy magazines, Margaret was locked in, calm, serious, almost radiant in her concentration. Jerry didn't approach her at first. He wasn't the kind of man who rushed headlong into things. But over the next few weeks, he found himself arriving at the library at the same time she did, quietly setting up at his table with his engineering textbooks. Occasionally their eyes met. A small smile here, a nod there. The beginning of something neither of them had words for yet. It was Margaret who finally broke the silence. One evening, when Jerry's pencil broke mid-scribble, she leaned over and offered him a spare. "You look like you're solving the world's problems over there," she teased gently. Jerry chuckled, taking the pencil, and for the first time they spoke. That small kindness grew into conversations. First about assignments, then about professors, and eventually about life beyond the classroom. Jerry discovered that Margaret was not only brilliant with numbers but also practical, almost to a fault. She came from a middle-class family that had seen both good years and lean ones, and she had learned early that money had to be respected, not flaunted. "I don't want the biggest house," she told Jerry one night over coffee. "I just want stability. The kind of life where you never have to look over your shoulder and wonder if you can pay the bills." Jerry listened, quietly amazed. In Margaret's words, he heard his own values reflected back at him. Where others dreamed of luxury, she dreamed of security. Where others chased status, she sought peace. They began dating in the simplest ways. Walks across campus, picnics on the lawn, evenings studying side by side. There were no flashy gifts, no grand gestures. Jerry would sometimes bring her a flower he had picked on the way to class, and she would beam as though he had given her diamonds. For them, love was not measured by extravagance but by consistency, by the quiet certainty of knowing they could rely on one another. Quick pause here. Do you believe love is built on big, flashy moments or in the small, everyday things? I'd love to hear your take in the comments. As their relationship deepened, so did their conversations about the future. Margaret was fascinated by the stock market, often clipping articles from the newspaper and running calculations in the margins. Jerry, with his methodical engineering mind, loved her discipline. Together, they began sketching a vision for their life: modest living, steady work, and careful investments. When they married shortly after graduation, they had little more than hand-me-down furniture and second-hand dishes. But what they lacked in possessions they made up for in resolve. They rented a tiny apartment downtown, barely large enough for a bed and a kitchen table, and lived on Margaret's accounting salary while Jerry took his first engineering job. They agreed to live on one income and save the other, a radical decision at a time when most young couples stretched themselves thin for bigger homes and newer cars. Their friends laughed at them. Why not enjoy life? Some asked. Why deny yourselves when you can afford more? But Jerry and Margaret didn't feel deprived. Their joy came from different places: quiet dinners together, long evening walks, and the thrill of watching their savings account inch upward month by month. It was Margaret who convinced Jerry to invest during the market dip in the late 1970s, when others were panicking. They started small, buying shares in companies they believed would endure. Each investment was made cautiously, discussed over countless cups of coffee, with Margaret's ledgers and Jerry's calculations guiding every move. Little by little their nest egg grew. They bought their first rental property before their 30th birthdays, a rundown duplex that they renovated themselves on weekends. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was theirs. Each nail hammered, each wall painted, felt like a step toward the life they had promised each other. And through it all, they remained invisible in plain sight. No one looking at Jerry and Margaret would have guessed they were building something remarkable. They still drove old cars, still packed lunches, still lived in that modest apartment. Their fortune was not in what the world could see, it was in what the world could not. By the time they reached their mid-30s, Jerry and Margaret were well on their way to financial independence. But for them, the true wealth wasn't in the growing balance sheets or the properties they acquired. It was in the life they were creating together. A life grounded in trust, humility, and shared purpose. And though neither of them could have foreseen it, those choices, that quiet discipline, would one day become Jerry's greatest weapon. For in a world that would later mistake his simplicity for weakness, the foundation he and Margaret built would stand as proof that true strength is often the least visible. If anyone had asked Jerry and Margaret Williams in their early 30s what they were building, they probably would have smiled politely and said, "Just a life." But beneath that simple answer lay a quiet strategy, one that few around them could see and even fewer could have understood. While others in their circle pursued outward symbols of success, new cars, bigger homes, expensive vacations, Jerry and Margaret were laying foundations in silence. Every dollar was treated like a seed, and every decision weighed not by how it looked today, but by what it might grow into tomorrow. Margaret was the architect of their first investments. Her training in accounting made her disciplined, and her patience gave her an edge many lacked. Where others jumped at hot tips, she stuck to the fundamentals: solid companies, steady dividends, industries that would endure beyond market fads. She clipped articles from newspapers, kept detailed ledgers, and reviewed company reports late into the night. Jerry would lean over her shoulder after work, his engineering mind drawn to the precision of her notes. "Slow and steady," she would whisper, tapping her pencil against the page. "That's how we'll do it." And she was right. Through the volatile markets of the late 70s and early 80s, they didn't panic when others sold in fear. They held firm, buying more when prices dipped. Their modest holdings slowly compounded, like drops of rain filling a bucket. Their first real estate venture, the rundown duplex they bought before turning 30, taught them more than just the mechanics of home repair. It taught them resilience. Weekends became workdays. Jerry would strip floors and repair wiring, while Margaret painted walls and balanced the renovation budget. It wasn't glamorous. Friends sometimes pitted them for spending Saturdays scraping old wallpaper instead of lounging at country clubs. But Margaret would smile and remind Jerry, "Every brushstroke is equity. Every nail is a step forward." The duplex turned profitable faster than they expected. The rental income, small as it was, opened a new path. Before long they purchased another property, then another. They weren't chasing quick flips. They wanted steady streams, assets that quietly paid them month after month. Within a decade, the couple who still drove their beat-up sedan and packed lunches had quietly become landlords of several small properties scattered across town. And yet they told no one. "Better to be underestimated," Jerry often said, "than envied." Their boldest move came in the mid-1980s. Margaret spotted a neglected office building on the edge of downtown, 4 stories of chipped brick and dusty windows, the kind of property people walked past without a second glance. But Margaret didn't see an eyesore. She saw potential. It was a risk. The purchase would stretch their savings and the renovations would test their patience. But Jerry trusted her instincts and together they signed the papers. The renovation was grueling. 4 months, Jerry balanced his full-time engineering job with late nights overseeing contractors. Margaret, meanwhile, managed every detail of the finances, ensuring they stayed on budget. They poured themselves into the building and slowly it transformed. By the time the first tenants moved in, the office building was not just a source of income. It was a symbol of everything they stood for: patience, vision, and faith in unseen value. Despite their growing portfolio, Jerry and Margaret never changed their way of life. They remained in their modest apartment far longer than anyone expected. Their clothes were plain, their dinners humble. Vacations, when they took them, were road trips rather than flights overseas. Friends often teased them. Some even questioned whether they were depriving themselves unnecessarily. But the Williamses never wavered. "Money is not for showing off," Margaret would say, "it's for building freedom." That freedom was their true luxury, the ability to make choices without fear, to know that storms could come and go without leaving them destitute. While others lived one paycheck away from collapse, Jerry and Margaret quietly fortified themselves against life's uncertainties. The end of the 1980s, Jerry and Margaret had built a life that few could have imagined from the outside. Their net worth had climbed into the millions, though almost no one knew it. They still looked, dressed, and lived like the couple next door. That invisibility was their strength. While envy toppled others, while greed lured friends into debt, Jerry and Margaret walked unnoticed, protected by their modesty. The world saw 2 ordinary people. Only their balance sheets told the extraordinary truth. And this was the paradox that defined their lives. Their fortune grew precisely because they never tried to look rich. Illness doesn't always arrive like a storm. Sometimes it creeps in quietly, disguised as fatigue, a cough that lingers too long, or a shadow on a medical scan that no one expected. For Jerry and Margaret Williams, it began with her complaints of constant tiredness, something she brushed off at first. She was, after all, a woman who never slowed down, balancing books, managing tenants, tending to her home with unshakable precision. Jerry noticed before she would admit it. Her steps grew slower, her laughter less frequent, her appetite smaller. When the doctor finally named it, an aggressive form of cancer, the word hollowed out their world in an instant. Jerry, who had once believed he could solve any problem with hard work and determination, found himself staring at something he could not fix. But he made himself a promise. If Margaret had to face this, she would not face it alone. He became her caretaker, her shield, and her anchor. The once tireless investor and organizer now sat at chemo appointments, holding her hand while the hours stretched on. He learned how to make her favorite soups, how to keep track of medications, how to change bed linens in the middle of the night when she was too weak to rise. The man who had spent his life building quietly behind the scenes now discovered a new purpose: serving the woman who had been the foundation of everything he was. Neighbors would see Jerry carrying groceries with trembling arms or walking slowly beside Margaret as she leaned on him, and they would whisper in admiration of his devotion. But Jerry didn't want admiration. He wanted time. More of it. Just one more year, one more season, one more morning where her smile greeted him across the kitchen table. Margaret, though, was as practical in illness as she had been in wealth. She knew the odds, understood the clock was ticking, and began to prepare her husband for a life without her. She would rest her thin hand over his and say, "Jerry, promise me you won't let grief swallow you. Promise me you'll protect what we've built, not just the money but the values behind it. You can't let loneliness make you careless. That's when people strike." Jerry didn't like hearing it. He would shake his head and whisper, "Don't talk like that. We've beaten harder things." But Margaret, ever steady, would look him in the eye and hold his silence until he finally nodded. She knew his heart too well. She knew grief could turn even the strongest man blind. Her decline was not dramatic. It was gradual, almost cruelly so, allowing Jerry to watch piece by piece as the vibrant woman he loved grew frail. Yet she never lost her mind or her dignity. Even in her final weeks, she spoke about the future, not hers but his. She told him to keep the apartment, to continue the work they had started, and to remember that wealth was safest when cloaked in simplicity. "Humility," she whispered one night, her voice barely more than breath, "is our greatest armor." The day Margaret died, Jerry felt as though the world itself had collapsed into silence. He was 61, a widower for the first time in his life, standing in an apartment filled with memories that now cut sharper than knives. For days he moved like a shadow, eating little, speaking less. Friends urged him to travel, to sell the apartment, to start fresh. But Jerry clung to the space as if it were the last piece of her. And then, one night, sitting in the chair where Margaret had so often read financial reports, Jerry remembered her final words. He heard them as clearly as if she had been beside him. "Don't let grief make you weak." It struck him like a command. He couldn't afford to drift. He couldn't let sorrow undo everything they had sacrificed for. He rose the next morning with a vow. He would protect their wealth, yes, but also their story. He would live in such a way that Margaret's life still echoed through his choices. If loneliness tempted him to recklessness, he would fight it. If others tried to exploit his vulnerability, he would resist. She had trusted him with their legacy, and he would not betray that trust. So Jerry carried on, quietly, invisibly. To the outside world, he looked like a tired widower in an old apartment, driving a car with more rust than shine. But in truth he was a guardian now, of memory, of fortune, of dignity. And though he often spoke to her empty chair, asking questions and whispering thoughts, he felt her presence urging him on. This vow, spoken in the shadows of his grief, would shape every decision he made in the years ahead. It would arm him when betrayal struck from the very people who should have loved him most. It would give him the strength to fight back when others thought he was too old, too soft, too weak. And though he didn't know it yet, Margaret's words had planted the seed for the greatest battle of his life, the one where his dignity, his fortune, and his very identity as a man would be put to the test. Life after Margaret settled into a quiet rhythm that most would have called unremarkable. Jerry Williams, once half of a partnership that had built a quiet empire, now lived alone in the same modest apartment he and Margaret had shared for decades. The apartment was tidy, though stripped of much of its warmth. Margaret's touches lingered, the lace curtains she had insisted on, the faded rug she had bargained for years ago, the framed photographs of their early days together. But without her presence, the place felt like a shrine more than a home. Jerry did not wallow though. True to his vow, he rose each morning with purpose. He worked part-time at the local hardware store, stocking shelves, offering advice to young homeowners and keeping himself busy. Customers knew him as the friendly older man who remembered the details of every tool and could suggest solutions better than some of the younger employees. His coworkers respected him, but few asked questions beyond casual greetings. To them, Jerry was simply a widower supplementing his pension, earning a little extra to get by. He still drove the same car he had owned for years, a 10-year-old sedan with peeling paint and a faint rattle when idling. It was reliable, nothing more. He wore flannel shirts in winter, simple short sleeves in summer, always pressed but never stylish. Neighbors saw him grocery shopping with coupons or carrying bags up the stairs alone, and they formed their own conclusions. Jerry, in their eyes, was a man living humbly because he had no choice. And his son Ethan, along with Ethan's wife Juliet, believed the same. Ethan had grown up never wanting for much, though he had never noticed how carefully his parents had disguised their means. Margaret had clipped coupons long after they could afford not to, and Jerry had always insisted on repairing rather than replacing. Ethan mistook this for limitation rather than discipline. By the time he married Juliet, he assumed his father was scraping along, dependent on his small pension and the few hours at the hardware store. Juliet fueled that assumption. From the moment she joined the family, she carried an air of condescension toward Jerry's simple lifestyle. She would smirk at his car, comment on how cramped his apartment must feel, or laugh at the way he chose to stay in rather than dine at expensive restaurants. "He means well," she would say to Ethan in a tone half dripping with pity, half laced with disdain, "but your father just doesn't understand how the world works anymore." Ethan, though uncomfortable with Juliet's remarks, never corrected her. Perhaps deep down he shared her belief. To him, his father was a relic of another time, a man whose quiet routines meant small means. He never asked about Jerry's finances, never wondered how his parents had managed to fund his college education without loans or provide small financial rescues throughout his 20s. He accepted generosity without curiosity. And Juliet, sharp-eyed and ambitious, assumed that any help they received came at Jerry's expense, a sacrifice from his already meager lifestyle. Meanwhile, Jerry continued to live under their misjudgment without complaint. He let them believe what they wanted. He had no need to prove otherwise. Margaret's words echoed in his mind. Humility is our greatest armor. To show his wealth would be to invite envy, manipulation, or worse. To hide it was to remain invisible, untouchable, underestimated. But even as he kept his silence, their assumptions began to grate on him. Juliet's barbs cut deeper than she realized. At family gatherings, she would remark on how admirable it was that Jerry still worked at his age, as if it were necessity rather than choice. She would suggest that he consider moving into a smaller place, better suited for a man alone. Her comments, always wrapped in a veneer of politeness, dripped with venom Jerry could taste. Ethan, blinded by loyalty to his wife or perhaps unwilling to confront uncomfortable truths, said nothing. Each silence widened the gulf between father and son. Still Jerry endured it. He told himself that patience was strength, that Margaret would want him to stay steady. He reminded himself that family ties, no matter how strained, were worth protecting. He convinced himself that Ethan might someday see through Juliet's vanity and cruelty. But beneath that patience was a spark of steel. Jerry knew the truth of his life. He was not scraping by, not barely holding on. He was a man of means, his fortune secured by decades of discipline, his freedom preserved by deliberate invisibility. And though Ethan and Juliet dismissed him as a frail old man clinging to pennies, Jerry understood something they did not. Misjudgment is often the first step toward betrayal. One evening, sitting alone at his small kitchen table, Jerry reflected on the irony of it all. His son and daughter-in-law pitied him, believing him weak and dependent, while in reality their lifestyle, their apartment, their credit cards, even the down payment for their extravagant wedding, had been quietly funded by his generosity. He had watched them spend what he gave without gratitude, without restraint, without the slightest suspicion of the truth. Jerry poured himself a glass of water and raised it as though in a toast to the empty chair across from him. "They think I'm a poor old man," he murmured, his voice low but steady. "Let them. For now." In that moment he felt Margaret's presence again, her warning clear. Do not let grief or loneliness make you weak. He would not. Their misjudgment was not his burden to correct. It was theirs to carry. And one day he suspected, it would cost them far more than they realized. Have you ever been underestimated because of how you looked, dressed, or lived? Share your experience in the comments. I'd love to hear how you turned that underestimation into strength. And while you're at it, tell me where you're watching from. It's powerful seeing how these stories connect us across the world. Juliet had always seen herself as a woman destined for more. She wasn't content with quiet living or modest comforts. To her, wealth wasn't just about security, it was about display, status, the power to command admiration in every room she entered. From the moment she married Ethan, she began scanning her new family for opportunities. And in her eyes, Jerry Williams was not a father-in-law to be cherished. He was an obstacle to be managed, a man clinging to space and assets that would be better in her hands. At first, her disdain showed in small remarks. She would compliment Jerry's charming little apartment, the word little pressed like a knife into his dignity. She would smile at his car and joke, "It's amazing that thing still runs," her laugh dismissing the years of careful maintenance that had kept it on the road. When Jerry wore his pressed shirts to family dinners, she'd sigh dramatically and say, "Classic, reliable, just like the rest of you." Ethan sometimes laughed along, sometimes said nothing, but never once defended his father. Juliet's ambition sharpened after their wedding plans began. Her vision for herself and Ethan was a life lived in grandeur, an apartment in the city, spacious and modern, a place where guests could marvel at her taste. Jerry's home, with its modest elegance and prime downtown location, became the object of her envy. The idea lodged in her mind: why should Jerry, a widower wasting away in loneliness, keep so much space for himself? Why shouldn't she and Ethan live there, breathe new life into it, make it their own? She began planting the seeds with subtlety. At dinners, she'd lean across the table, her voice smooth. "Don't you ever feel that this place is too big for one man, Jerry? It must get so quiet." At family gatherings, she'd remark to others, just loud enough for Jerry to hear, "It's such a shame that beautiful apartment isn't filled with a growing family." Jerry, always patient, would smile politely and change the subject. But Margaret's warning echoed in his mind: "Don't let loneliness make you weak." He knew what Juliet was doing. He could feel her eyes measuring every inch of his life as if appraising it for takeover. When subtlety failed to yield results, Juliet grew bolder. One evening, as Jerry sat quietly after dinner, she pressed the matter openly. "Jerry, Ethan and I have been thinking. It just doesn't make sense for you to stay in that apartment. It's too much space and frankly you'd be better off in a smaller place. Less to clean, less to worry about. We could take the apartment, turn it into a real family home, and you could move somewhere more manageable." Jerry looked at her carefully, his hands folded in his lap. His silence was steady, but his eyes carried weight. Juliet mistook it for hesitation, even weakness. She smiled sweetly as though she were offering him a kindness. Ethan sat beside her, shifting uncomfortably, but said nothing. That silence was worse than Juliet's words. It was betrayal in its quietest form. Juliet pressed on in the weeks that followed. She mocked his routines, sneered at his frugality, and treated his dignity like an inconvenience to be brushed aside. "It's not healthy for you to cling to the past," she told him one afternoon, her tone dripping with false concern. "Margaret wouldn't want you hoarding space you don't need. Think of it as a fresh start." But Jerry knew better. He saw through the mask of care into the hunger underneath. Juliet didn't want what was best for him, she wanted what was best for herself. She was ambitious, restless, determined to climb over anyone, even family, if it meant living the life she believed she deserved. Ethan's silence became a wound that deepened with every passing remark. Jerry had hoped his son would one day find his voice, would rise to defend the man who had raised him, provided for him, sacrificed for him. But Ethan remained quiet, a shadow in Juliet's wake, letting her words chip away at the bond between father and son. Jerry never lashed out. He never raised his voice. But inside, something was stirring, a tension, a quiet storm forming behind the calm. Juliet thought she was wearing him down, but what she was really doing was sharpening his resolve. Each cruel word, each mocking laugh, each press to surrender his apartment was fuel. She didn't know it yet, but she was building the case against herself, brick by brick. And Jerry, remembering Margaret's voice, began to prepare. He had been underestimated before. He would be underestimated again. But the time would come when Juliet's ambitions would be laid bare for all to see, and when that moment arrived, Jerry would not be silent. The help began modestly, a quiet transfer here, a discreet check there. Ethan had once called, embarrassed, to ask if Jerry might lend him money to cover a late rent payment. Jerry had agreed without hesitation, and when Ethan said he'd pay it back, Jerry waved him off with a gentle, "Just focus on keeping a roof over your heads." From that moment, the pattern set itself. What Ethan and Juliet never knew was that their roof, their credit, even their wedding plans, were being quietly supported by Jerry's unseen hand. Over 3 years, more than $160,000 slipped from Jerry's accounts into theirs. It covered back rent, smothered credit card fires, cushioned overdraft fees, and even padded Juliet's endless demands for a wedding worthy of her image. Jerry never told them the full extent of what he gave. When Juliet preened in her designer dress, she never imagined it had been bought with money Jerry released quietly into Ethan's account. When they toasted with champagne at fine restaurants, Juliet boasting of their success, Jerry was the shadow behind the bill. Only Carlos knew the truth. Carlos Martinez, Jerry's longtime financial advisor, had raised an eyebrow when he first noticed the pattern. Each month, significant sums disappeared, not reckless withdrawals but carefully timed transfers that Jerry instructed with steady calm. One afternoon, Carlos leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and asked, "Jerry, are you sure about this? It's not the numbers I'm worried about, you can afford it, but the principle. They don't seem to know where this money's coming from. Doesn't that bother you?" Jerry, his face lined with both age and weariness, offered a small smile. "A father doesn't keep score, Carlos. Ethan's finding his way. If I can keep him from falling too hard, maybe he'll stand stronger in time." Carlos didn't press further, but he knew. He saw the danger. Jerry was bleeding generosity into a well that had no bottom. And worst of all, the recipients had no gratitude. Ethan accepted the help quietly, never asking where the money came from, never wondering how his father, who scraped by on a pension and part-time wages, could always appear with exactly what was needed. Juliet, meanwhile, assumed the money was borrowed from friends, perhaps even begged. Her disdain for Jerry grew as she convinced herself that his support for them came at his own sacrifice. In her mind, she was milking the last drops from a poor old man who should have already given up his space, his independence, his stubborn pride. Jerry endured their blindness in silence. He told himself that love was reason enough. But deep down, he also knew something Margaret had once whispered to him. Sometimes kindness, unchecked, becomes fuel for selfishness. In his small apartment, Jerry would sit at night with his checkbook, running the numbers again and again. Not because he worried he couldn't afford it. His investments remained strong, his property stable, but because he wanted to measure how far love had taken him into sacrifice. Each figure on the page was not just money, it was a piece of his resolve, a tally of his patience. The irony was bitter. They thought him weak, scraping, barely surviving, while in truth he was the very reason they had survived at all. Without him, eviction notices would have arrived. Creditors would have circled like vultures. Their perfect wedding would have been nothing more than a courthouse signature. And yet they dismissed him as a burden, a man in their way. Jerry never sought credit. He never revealed the truth. But in the quiet of his nights, he began to wonder if his silence was the very thing feeding their contempt. By shielding Ethan and Juliet from reality, he had allowed them to believe lies, not just about money but about him. And though he did not yet know it, those lies would one day collide with truth in the most public way imaginable. The hidden hand that had carried them for years would eventually withdraw. And when it did, Ethan and Juliet would learn, too late, that the man they mocked was the very foundation holding their world together. Let me ask you something. Have you ever helped someone in secret, giving more than they knew, only to be met with ingratitude? Share your story in the comments. It might remind someone else why boundaries matter. And don't forget to tell me where you're tuning in from. It's amazing seeing how these stories resonate across countries and lives. Juliet's tongue was sharper than ever. What had once been sly remarks whispered under her breath at family gatherings had grown into bold, open critiques. To her, Jerry was an old man clinging to outdated ways, a burden who refused to move on with the times. She spoke about him to Ethan as if Jerry were some obligation they had inherited rather than family, someone to be tolerated rather than loved. Honestly, Ethan, Juliet sighed one evening, her wine glass swirling lazily in her hand. Your father's stubbornness is pathetic. That dingy apartment, that rusty car, it's embarrassing. What are people supposed to think when they see him? Don't you think it reflects on us? Ethan shifted uncomfortably, but he no longer defended his father the way he once did. At first he had pushed back, reminding Juliet of Jerry's sacrifices, of his years of hard work, of the values he stood for. But Juliet's persistence wore him down, drop by drop, until he began to see his father less through his own eyes and more through hers. Where Ethan once saw dignity in Jerry's simplicity, he now noticed only the creases of age in his father's shirts, the worn soles of his shoes, the stubborn refusal to buy new things. Slowly, insidiously, Ethan began to distance himself. When Jerry called, Ethan's replies grew shorter. When Jerry stopped by, Ethan glanced at Juliet for permission before inviting him in. And when Juliet made snide remarks in Jerry's presence, Ethan no longer rushed to smooth the moment. He stayed quiet, his silence a quiet betrayal that cut deeper than any insult Juliet hurled. Jerry felt the shift like cold wind creeping under a door. A father knows when the bond with his child begins to fray, and though he never said a word, Jerry's heart sank a little each time Ethan chose Juliet's side with his silence. And yet he kept giving. Each month, another discreet transfer left Jerry's account. Bills were quietly paid, debts erased before Ethan even realized how close they were to disaster. Juliet mocked Jerry's smallness, blind to the fact that the very roof above her head existed because of him. Ethan, caught between the wife he wanted to please and the father he didn't want to lose, allowed himself to believe that money appeared by coincidence, or that Juliet's networking skills had opened doors. But Jerry knew the truth. Every dollar was another piece of him laid at their feet. And with each unacknowledged sacrifice, the gap between him and his son widened. Some nights, Jerry sat in his apartment staring at the old photo albums Margaret had made, running his thumb over Ethan's childhood smile. Where did that boy go? He wondered. The boy who once rushed into his arms after school, the boy who promised he'd always look after his parents no matter what. Now Jerry could feel him slipping away, slowly like sand through tired fingers. Carlos noticed too. During their quarterly meeting, he leaned forward, brows furrowed. Jerry, you're carrying them and they don't even see it. At what point does helping become enabling? Jerry gave a faint smile. At the point where they stand on their own. And if that day never comes, then maybe that's just the cross I carry. But inside, doubt gnawed. He had always believed sacrifice was love. Yet now, sacrifice seemed to be building walls instead of bridges. Juliet's contempt was louder. Ethan's loyalty was quieter. And Jerry, despite everything he gave, was left lonelier than ever. The cracks in the family were no longer hairline fractures. They were spreading, deepening, threatening to split wide open. And though Jerry still hid his generosity in the shadows, he was beginning to realize that his silence was costing him the very thing he treasured most, his son's heart. The day of the wedding arrived draped in gold and silk. Juliet had spared no expense, at least that's what everyone believed. The venue was the kind of place most couples only dreamed about, its chandeliers glowing like captured starlight. Musicians tuned their instruments at the corner of the ballroom while staff in crisp uniforms scurried about, arranging towers of exotic flowers and trays of champagne. Guests streamed in, dressed to impress, their murmurs filled with admiration. Magnificent! one woman whispered to her partner as she took in the shimmering decor. Juliet really outdid herself, another man commented, sipping from his crystal flute. Ethan must have some serious backing. Who knew Jerry's boy had it in him? The word stung Jerry more than he let on. He stood near the back of the hall, a quiet figure in a well-worn suit, his tie knotted neatly though it was several years out of fashion. To most of the crowd, he looked like what they believed him to be, a modest, aging man with little to his name, a relic among the glittering elite that filled the room. Few gave him more than a polite nod as they swept past toward the bar or the dance floor. What none of them knew, what no one ever seemed to realize, was that Jerry had paid for all of it. From the $10,000 floral arrangements to the $8,000 cake towering with sugar roses, from the live orchestra to the five-star catering, his quiet generosity had made the spectacle possible. In all, nearly $53,000 of his hard-earned savings had gone into this single day, not to mention the debts he had already covered for Ethan and Juliet in the months leading up to it. And yet, as the bride and groom made their entrance to thunderous applause, Jerry remained invisible. Juliet radiated triumph as she swept into the ballroom, her gown glittering under the lights, her chin lifted in pride. Ethan walked beside her, looking both proud and nervous, his smile betraying a flicker of unease. Juliet clung to his arm like a trophy, basking in the adoration of the guests, soaking in every compliment as though she had orchestrated the entire affair through her own brilliance. When they passed Jerry, Juliet barely glanced at him. No nod of acknowledgement, no whispered word of thanks. Just a fleeting look that carried more irritation than gratitude, as though his very presence threatened to tarnish her perfect evening. Jerry sat at his assigned table, positioned awkwardly near the back, sandwiched between distant cousins and acquaintances. From there, he watched as Juliet commanded the room, offering air kisses and handshakes, her laughter ringing like a bell. Ethan trailed close behind, his role reduced to smiling politely, nodding in agreement, letting Juliet shine. The food arrived in waves, lobster tails, filet mignon, delicate pastries, all of it meticulously prepared. Guests marveled aloud at the extravagance. Some speculated about the cost, their voices tinged with envy. Jerry listened quietly, offering a small smile, though his heart ached at the irony. Here he was, the man who had made it all possible, treated as though he were nothing more than an afterthought. His late wife Margaret would have seen him. She would have squeezed his hand under the table and whispered, "You're the reason this is happening. Don't forget that." But Margaret was gone, and Jerry was left alone in the shadows of his own sacrifice. As the evening wore on, the gulf between him and his son seemed to widen. Ethan glanced Jerry's way only a handful of times, each time with an expression Jerry couldn't quite read, guilt, perhaps, or shame, but never once did he approach him to sit, to share a laugh, to acknowledge what had been done for him. Juliet, meanwhile, avoided Jerry's eyes entirely, as if pretending he wasn't there would erase him altogether. And Jerry, in his quiet dignity, let it be. He lifted his glass when toasts were made. He applauded politely when the couple danced their first dance. He smiled at distant relatives who asked if he was managing okay on his pension. Inside, however, a storm was brewing. For years, Jerry had endured Juliet's cutting remarks, her subtle humiliations, her constant reminders that he was a man of little means in her eyes. For years, he had given without acknowledgement, poured himself out for a son who no longer looked at him with pride. Tonight, under the glittering lights of a wedding he had funded but was not invited to share, Jerry realized something powerful. Silence had a cost. And the bill was coming due. The applause, the laughter, the music, all of it washed over him like a wave he no longer wished to stand against. Somewhere deep within, a quiet resolve began to harden. Juliet thought him invisible. Ethan thought him weak. The guests thought him insignificant. But they would all soon learn the truth. The reception was in full swing, the kind of celebration that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. Laughter floated through the ballroom, mingling with the swell of music as waiters refilled champagne glasses. Juliet glowed at the center of it all, her wedding gown shimmering beneath the lights as she held court with clusters of guests who hung on her every word. Ethan stayed close, smiling, nodding, his presence more accessory than partner. Jerry remained near the edges as he had all night. He watched with quiet dignity, sipping slowly from his glass, still trying to find pride in his son's happiness. Yet the longer he sat, the more isolated he felt. Guests barely noticed him, and those who did saw only the old man in the simple suit. Not one of them could guess the truth, that this entire display, this luxury that dazzled them, had been carried on his back. It happened between the toasts and the cutting of the cake. Juliet approached Jerry, her smile brittle, her eyes gleaming with calculation. She leaned down, her voice just loud enough to carry beyond the table. "Jerry," she said, her tone deceptively sweet, "Ethan and I have been talking. This apartment of yours, it's wasted on you. A man your age doesn't need so much space. We could make such better use of it." Conversations around them began to falter. Heads turned, ears perked. The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. Jerry looked up at her, his face calm though his heart quickened. He had expected insults before, she had never hidden her disdain, but not this. Not here, not now. "I'm comfortable where I am," Jerry replied, his voice even, steady. "That apartment is my home. I'm not giving it up." Juliet's smile cracked. Her eyes narrowed, and with a flick of venom she hissed, "Selfish old man." The silence in the room was palpable. Guests leaned closer, some exchanging uneasy glances, others pretending not to notice. Ethan stood just behind Juliet, shifting on his feet, his jaw tight. He said nothing. Juliet's fury boiled over. In one swift, shocking motion, she raised her hand and brought it across Jerry's cheek. The sound echoed through the ballroom, sharp as a gunshot. Gasps rippled through the room. A woman dropped her fork. Someone whispered, "Did she just?" Phones lifted discreetly, screens glowing as people began recording. Jerry did not move. He did not raise his hand to his cheek, though the sting burned hot against his skin. His eyes met Juliet's, steady and unflinching, his dignity intact even as humiliation washed over him. "You don't deserve it," Juliet spat, her voice trembling with rage. "You don't deserve half of what you have. And if you really cared about Ethan, you'd hand it over without a second thought." Jerry's gaze shifted to his son, the boy he had once cradled in his arms, the young man he had quietly supported for years. Ethan's lips parted as if he might speak, but no words came. He lowered his eyes. The silence of Ethan's betrayal cut deeper than the sting of Juliet's hand. Jerry's heart broke in that instant, not because of the slap, not even because of Juliet's cruelty, but because his son, the boy Margaret had loved so fiercely, the boy Jerry had sacrificed for time and again, stood mute while his father was humiliated in front of 130 witnesses. The applause, the music, the celebration, all of it seemed to dissolve. The room felt smaller, tighter, filled with eyes and whispers. Jerry sat tall, refusing to crumble under the weight of shame. Margaret's voice echoed faintly in his memory, "Don't let them break you, Jerry. Never let them break you." And though the sting on his cheek would fade, the scar of Ethan's silence would never leave him. "Now let me ask you something. If you were in Jerry's shoes, sitting in that ballroom, would you have stayed silent, or would you have spoken up? Drop your thoughts in the comments because this is a moment where dignity and rage collide. And while you're at it, let me know where you're watching from. I love seeing just how far this story travels. The ballroom still hummed with uneasy chatter as Jerry slipped quietly toward the exit. Whispers followed him, not out of respect but curiosity, scandal clinging to the air like smoke after a fire. His cheek still burned where Juliet's hand had struck, though the sting on his skin was nothing compared to the ache in his chest. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The image of Ethan's silence, his son's downcast eyes, his refusal to speak, was already seared into his memory. That, more than Juliet's venom, was the final crack in the dam Jerry had held inside himself for years. Outside, the cool night wrapped around him, sharp and bracing. The city lights blinked like distant stars, indifferent to his humiliation. Jerry leaned against the railing, closing his eyes, and for a moment, he let the world fall away. Margaret's voice came to him, clear and steady, as though she were standing beside him. "Don't let grief or loneliness make you weak, Jerry. Protect what we built. Protect yourself." He whispered into the night, his voice trembling. "I hear you, Maggie. I hear you now." For years he had mistaken endurance for strength. He thought patience, silence, and quiet giving were the answer. But standing alone outside that glittering hall, he finally understood. Humility was not weakness and dignity was not silence. The time for hiding was over. He pulled out his phone, his hand steady despite the storm in his chest. With one motion he dialed a number he had memorized years ago. "Carlos," Jerry said when the line clicked alive. "Jerry? It's late, are you all right?" Carlos's voice carried concern, but also the sharpness of a man who knew when something important was about to unfold. "I need you at the venue," Jerry said, his voice low, resolute. "Bring the documents. All of them." There was a pause. Then Carlos exhaled slowly. "It's time, isn't it?" "It's time," Jerry replied. "They think I'm finished. They think I'm weak. But tonight, Carlos, tonight they're going to learn the truth." As he ended the call, Jerry straightened his posture. The sting on his cheek no longer mattered. What mattered was reclaiming the dignity that had been trampled under Juliet's heel, restoring the honor that Ethan's silence had stolen. The ballroom doors loomed before him, golden and heavy. He could hear laughter again inside, Juliet's triumphant voice cutting through the crowd. Jerry tightened his grip on his phone, drawing strength not from the room behind those doors, but from the memory of Margaret's steady hand in his. For the first time in years, Jerry felt something stir within him. Not bitterness, not resignation, but fire. A father had been humiliated, yes. But a man had awakened. And when Carlos arrived with the truth in his hands, Jerry knew the entire world was about to see him for who he truly was. Not a frail old man, not a burden, but a protector, a builder, and a fighter who had been underestimated for far too long. The ballroom doors swung open once more. Conversations faltered, the clinking of glasses stilled, and 130 pairs of eyes turned toward the unexpected sight of Jerry Williams returning. His cheek still bore the faint mark of Juliet's hand, but there was no trace of defeat in his posture now. He walked with a calm, deliberate stride, Carlos a step behind him carrying a sleek leather briefcase. Juliet froze mid-laugh, her champagne glass poised in the air. Ethan stiffened at her side, his smile evaporating. Guests shifted in their seats, whispering. Some had their phones discreetly raised, recording again, sensing something extraordinary was about to unfold. Jerry didn't raise his voice, yet when he spoke, it cut through the ballroom like a knife. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for interrupting your celebration. But there are things that need to be said, truths that can no longer remain in the shadows. He paused, his eyes sweeping the room. For years I've been dismissed as nothing more than a tired old man scraping by. Tonight I was told I don't deserve my own home. I was humiliated publicly by my own daughter-in-law. And my son, Jerry's gaze fell squarely on Ethan, who squirmed under the weight of it, stood silent. A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. Juliet rolled her eyes and forced a laugh. Oh, for heaven's sake, Jerry. Must you make a scene? Jerry turned to Carlos with a quiet nod. Carlos placed the briefcase on a nearby table and opened it with precision. Inside were neatly organized files, contracts, and printed bank statements. He handed Jerry the first folder, which Jerry held up for all to see. This, Jerry said firmly, is the truth. Margaret and I spent 40 years building a life in silence. Investing, saving, creating a foundation of wealth that we chose not to flaunt. While the world saw simplicity, behind the curtain lay a fortune. Gasps rose from the guests as Jerry laid out the figures. A $5.4 million investment account. A fully owned downtown office building worth millions more. Rental properties. And yes, my apartment, which Juliet so graciously suggested I surrender. I'm not the frail man you assumed. I am a man who built something with my wife's love and vision. Juliet's face flushed crimson. She forced another brittle laugh, her hand tightening on Ethan's arm. This is ridiculous. He's delusional. Carlos interrupted smoothly, his voice carrying authority. These are verified legal documents, Mrs. Williams. Bank statements. Property deeds. Investment records. Everything is legitimate. I have been Jerry's financial advisor for 25 years. The room buzzed with shock. Some guests leaned forward, whispering numbers under their breath. Phones captured every word, every gesture, every flicker of Juliet's disbelief. Jerry wasn't finished. And yet, despite all of this, he continued, his voice steady, I gave. Quietly. For 3 years I paid your rent. Cleared your debts. Covered your wedding cost. $162,000, all from a man you mocked. Tonight alone, I paid $53,000 for this event you call your own. The words landed like stones in a still pond. The room erupted in murmurs, some guests audibly gasping, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Juliet's composure cracked. You can't just say this here. But Jerry held up a hand, silencing her. His voice grew firmer. And tonight it ends. Every cent of support gone. The $53,000 I advanced for this wedding canceled. The credit cards I paid closed. From this moment forward, Juliet Ethan, you are on your own. Juliet's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor. She looked around wildly, searching for an ally, but found only shocked faces staring back. Ethan's face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing without words. I have also rewritten my will, Jerry added, his eyes narrowing. Neither of you will inherit a cent. The fortune you mocked me for not having will go instead to causes that matter, charities dedicated to protecting the elderly from abuse. The weight of his words settled over the room like thunder after lightning. Phones caught every second, ensuring the humiliation Juliet had so eagerly dished out would live on far beyond these gilded walls. Juliet sputtered, her voice shrill now, stripped of polish. "You can't do this to us. You can't." But Jerry stood taller than he had in years, his dignity fully restored. "No, Juliet. You did this to yourself." The ballroom erupted in chaos, guests whispering, some openly laughing at Juliet's hysteria, others shaking their heads at Ethan's cowardice. What had begun as a night of triumph for the couple had become their public undoing. And in the center of it all, Jerry Williams, the man they thought invisible, stood unbroken, resolute, and finally seen. The ballroom fiasco had ended in chaos, guests murmuring, phones buzzing, Juliet shrieking as Ethan dragged her out of the spotlight. But humiliation did not humble her. If anything, it sharpened her anger into a weapon. In the days that followed, Juliet and Ethan retreated into silence, avoiding Jerry's calls and ignoring messages from relatives who had witnessed the scandal. Social media had already begun to spread the videos. Jerry's calm revelation, Juliet's slap, the gasps of 130 guests. Clips bounced from one platform to another, captioned with words like respect for elders. And the slap that backfired. Comments poured in by the thousands, some praising Jerry, others mocking Juliet's arrogance. Juliet read them all, her fury growing with every scroll. "We are not going to be the punchline of some old man's pity parade," she hissed, tossing her phone onto the couch. Ethan sat with his head in his hands. "You heard Carlos. It's all legal. He has everything locked up. What are we supposed to do? Just accept it?" Juliet's eyes narrowed. "No. We fight back." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "If Jerry wants to parade around like some genius investor, let's remind people what he really is, an unstable old man. People already think the elderly lose touch. All we need to do is plant the right doubts." Ethan hesitated. "You're talking about having him declared incompetent," Juliet finished for him, her smile cold and sharp. "If the court believes he can't manage his affairs, then guess who gets control of his assets? Us." The seed was planted. They began quietly. Juliet reached out to friends and acquaintances, slipping rumors into casual conversations. "Jerry's been forgetting things lately," she would say with feigned concern. "He gets confused. Did you see how erratic he was at the wedding?" The whispers spread, carried faster than wildfire by gossip-hungry ears. Ethan, though still uneasy, followed her lead. He mentioned Jerry's age to colleagues, implying that his father wasn't as sharp as he once was. Together they crafted a picture of a man slipping into decline, his fortune the tragic toy of a failing mind. Next came the lawyers. Juliet, dressed in her most professional attire, walked into a downtown office with Ethan in tow. She presented their story with theatrical precision, painting Jerry as a danger to himself and his finances. Ethan nodded along, his silence now serving a new purpose: agreement. The attorney listened, taking notes, tapping his pen against the desk. "If what you're saying is true, there are legal avenues," he admitted. "But courts require evidence. Medical evaluations. Witnesses." Juliet smiled thinly. "Leave that to us." She already had names in mind, neighbors they could manipulate, relatives they could sway, even a doctor who owed her a favor. Bit by bit she would build a case. Meanwhile, Jerry remained unaware of the storm brewing, focusing instead on regaining his peace after the confrontation. He tended his small balcony garden, watered the tomatoes Margaret had once loved, and found solace in the quiet. But the rumors had begun to circle back. Lucy, his niece, mentioned hearing odd questions from mutual friends. His neighbor Joseph noticed people speaking about Jerry in hushed tones at the corner cafe. Whispers were reaching him, carried on the wind like the faintest warning of a coming storm. Juliet and Ethan had lost the battle in the ballroom, but in their minds the war was far from over. And this time they weren't playing fair. "Now let me put this to you. If your own family tried to paint you as incompetent just to steal what you worked for, how would you fight back? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget, drop where you're watching from. It's powerful to see how this story resonates across the world." The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and paper, a place where truth and lies were stripped bare. Jerry walked through its heavy doors with Lucy at his side, her hand resting gently on his arm. Joseph followed close behind, his steady presence radiating the kind of quiet strength Jerry had always admired. Amelia, sharp and confident in her tailored suit, carried the thick binder of documents that would prove his fortune was no accident, but the result of decades of discipline and sacrifice. Inside the courtroom, Juliet sat like a coiled spring beside Ethan, her face painted with indignation. She wore a designer jacket, one Jerry suspected he had unknowingly funded years earlier. Ethan looked pale, his hands fidgeting in his lap. Both avoided Jerry's eyes. The judge glanced over the files. "We are here today to address the petition filed by Ethan and Juliet Whitman, seeking guardianship over Mr. Gerald Whitman's financial and personal affairs on the grounds of alleged incompetence." Juliet leaned forward dramatically, her voice dripping with false concern. "Your Honor, my father-in-law is a good man, but he's confused. He's making reckless decisions and we fear he will squander what little he has left. We only want to protect him." Jerry said nothing, his silence deliberate. Instead, Lucy rose first. "Your Honor, I'm Jerry's niece. I've spent countless hours with him these past years. He is not confused. He's more lucid than most people my age. The only reckless people here are the ones who've drained him dry while mocking his modest life." A ripple moved through the courtroom. Next, Joseph stood. "I live next door. I've watched Jerry tend his home, manage his routines, and offer kindness even when it wasn't returned. This is not a man slipping into incompetence. This is a man whose love has been exploited." Juliet rolled her eyes, but her jaw tightened. Amelia was last. She strode forward, setting her binder down with a purposeful thud. "Your Honor, I'm a licensed real estate broker and longtime friend of Jerry. These documents," she opened the binder to reveal meticulous investment records, "show decades of wise decisions, property acquisitions, stock portfolios, and a commercial building managed with precision. He isn't reckless. He is strategic. And while Jerry gave generously to his son and daughter-in-law, it was done knowingly. They are not victims. They are beneficiaries who demanded more until he had no choice but to stop." The judge leafed through the documents, his expression shifting from neutral to thoughtful. And then came the blow Juliet had not anticipated. Lucy connected her phone to the courtroom's projector and played the viral wedding video. The room fell into stunned silence as Juliet's slap echoed from the speakers, followed by Jerry's quiet dignity as he revealed the fortune and withdrew support. The gasps of 130 wedding guests could be heard, followed by Juliet's shrieking outrage. When the clip ended, the courtroom buzzed with murmurs. The judge looked at Juliet with raised brows. "This is your example of his incompetence? A man calmly setting boundaries while enduring public assault." Juliet's composure cracked. Her face flushed crimson. Ethan shrank further into his chair. Jerry finally rose, his voice steady, carrying the weight of a lifetime. "Your Honor, my late wife made me promise to protect what we built together. I lived simply not because I had to, but because I chose to. I gave out of love and in return I was ridiculed. But I am not confused and I am not weak. I am simply done being used." The judge leaned back, tapping his pen. "The evidence is clear. The petition is denied. Furthermore, I caution both petitioners. This court does not take kindly to manipulation. If I hear of further harassment, you will answer for it." The gavel struck, final and sharp. Jerry exhaled, the burden lifting. Lucy squeezed his arm, Joseph smiled softly, and Amelia gave him a nod of quiet triumph. Across the aisle, Juliet's face twisted with disbelief, while Ethan stared at the floor, shame written in every line of his body. The courtroom had been their battlefield, and Jerry had walked out victorious, not because of wealth, but because truth had finally spoken louder than lies. 2 years had passed since that fateful day in court, and Jerry Williams's life no longer resembled the quiet, overlooked existence he once led. His apartment, once seen by Juliet as too much space for an old man, had blossomed into a sanctuary. Sunlight streamed through the windows each morning, warming rows of potted herbs, flowers, and tomatoes that lined the balcony. The community garden just down the street had become his second home, a place where children laughed, seniors shared stories, and Jerry felt Margaret's presence in the soil beneath his hands. But beyond the garden, Jerry's name had become a beacon. The Jerry Williams Foundation for Senior Protection was no longer just an idea scrawled in the back of a notebook. It was real, thriving, and serving over 400 elderly men and women who had been silenced, manipulated, or abandoned by those they trusted most. With Amelia's guidance, Lucy's energy, and Joseph's steady support, the foundation grew into a national movement. Jerry didn't just fund it, he lived it. He visited seniors personally, listened to their stories, and reminded them that dignity was not a gift others could take away, but a right they carried until their last breath. His memoir, When Love Hurts, An Elderly Man Fights Back, hit shelves the following spring. What began as late-night reflections by his bedside became a national bestseller. Readers wrote letters and emails by the thousands. Sons, daughters, grandparents, even strangers who had been inspired to reclaim their own worth. Jerry would sit in his armchair, tea steaming beside him as he read each story aloud to himself, smiling through tears. Margaret had once urged him to protect their wealth and his spirit. Now, through his book and foundation, he was protecting countless others. Meanwhile, the lives of Ethan and Juliet unraveled with painful predictability. The lavish lifestyle they had once flaunted slipped through their fingers. Without Jerry's silent hand funding their every indulgence, debts mounted. Juliet's temper and pride burned bridges faster than Ethan could repair them. Bankruptcy followed eviction. Their marriage crumbled under the weight of unmet expectations. Juliet left, taking baby Oliver with her, and eventually disappeared into another city. Ethan, left alone, reached out occasionally to his father. But his messages were shallow, laced with pleas for money rather than apologies. Jerry read them, sighed, and deleted each one without reply. And yet, in the quiet moments of the night, Jerry still mourned. He mourned the son he had lost to pride and weakness, and the grandson he had never held. He wondered sometimes what Oliver's laugh might sound like, or if he had Margaret's eyes. But Jerry also knew that love, no matter how deep, could not excuse cruelty or manipulation. His resolve remained firm. Dignity came before toxic ties. The world, however, saw Jerry not as a man who had lost, but as one who had risen. News outlets called him a symbol of resilience, proof that even in the autumn of life, one could still stand tall against betrayal and reclaim self-worth. Universities invited him to speak. Community centers welcomed him with open arms. And every time he walked through the foundation's front doors, greeted by grateful smiles, Jerry felt lighter. His pain transformed into purpose. One late afternoon, as the garden glowed gold under the setting sun, Jerry knelt beside a patch of daisies. Children ran past, laughter echoing through the air. Lucy walked up behind him, handing him a glass of water. "You've built something beautiful, Uncle Jerry," she said softly. Jerry smiled, dirt on his hands, light in his eyes. "We built it, Lucy. Margaret planted the seed and we just made sure it grew." For the first time in years, Jerry felt whole. Not because the pain was gone, but because he had chosen not to let it define him. His story had become a mirror for others, reflecting courage, healing, and the truth that it is never too late to reclaim one's worth. And now I'll ask you, what does reclaiming your worth mean to you? Have you ever had to walk away from someone you love in order to protect your dignity? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to let us know where you're watching from. It inspires us to see how far Jerry's story has traveled.